Listen, whatever you think you know about the quiet houses at the edge of town, throw it into the river now. There is a smell under the moss, a ledger of sins hidden beneath polite porches. You were never meant to hear this. The first thing you need to understand is that power learned to hide its appetite in plain sight. The richest men in the county did not hide in darkness. They built their darkness into daylight. They carved rituals out of tax law and etiquette, and they smoothed over murder with signatures. This is a story about one of those men, and the bargain he made when he decided that his name mattered more than a human life. It begins like so many other corrupt bargains, a ledger, a threat, and a symbol stamped in wax. But it will not end how he expects. We will go together down a corridor of choices no decent person would choose, and you will watch a man in search of respect trade his blood for silence. Imagine a house built with honeyed floors, a staircase that never creaks to anyone save those who are too late. Imagine a man who has been taught to believe cruelty is a currency, and money is how you win the world. He has friends in the law, friends in the pulpit, men who recite scripture the way they recite contracts. They call themselves stewards, benevolent guardians of order. In private, they call themselves the brethren. They did not meet in oak-paneled rooms to play cards. They met in basements to decide who would live and who would be erased when the rising cost of their comforts required it. The scene I will draw for you moves slowly at first. A letter with a symbol, a sickle crossed with grain, the emblem of a network that fed on the bodies and voices of others. The man's daughter is not a character you will pity immediately. She is heavy with medicines and secrets, treated like an illness rather than a person. People who study power learn its favorite trick: redefine a victim as illness, then treat the treatment as truth. He has debts he cannot pay, and the brethren have produced a solution: surrender dignity in exchange for solvency. But the true operation of power is never as simple as a bargain. Power must be proven, and proof often means spectacle. So a man who wants to remain in the county's inner circle agrees, slitting his conscience like the ribbon on his ledger. And he does the thing that few would do out loud. He places his daughter under the control of another human being in a way the law will not record as property, but every witness will understand as possession. The town reacts with scandal, but scandal is only a costume for a deeper crime. The real crime is what he intends to hide, the pattern he thinks he can bury by wrapping it in medical care and necessary treatments. Behind his calculation sits something older and more patient. A man who believes institutions protect him and that institutions can be tuned, like instruments, to play the tune he needs. This story pulls at that chord. It shows how a gentleman's respectability is a thin fabric over bones, how a culture of secrecy greases the gears of monstrous enterprise. Tonight, I'm not here to let you leave comfortable. I'm here to make you understand that when men like him whisper to one another behind closed doors, the world answers in blood. So understand the shape of the room now, the river dark at the edge of the property, the live oaks with their funeral moss, a house with a cellar that keeps more than wine. Keep your senses. You're going to need them. You have to accept the truth immediately. Cruelty is never merely physical. Those who practice it understand the first, most effective way to control is to manufacture doubt. They make you question your memory, your senses, your very sanity. They call it medical care, spiritual counseling, legal procedure. They rebrand violence as expertise. The daughter they described as mad had been given labels: hysteria, nervous disorder, as if a diagnosis could be a door to lock her voice away. But here is the deeper mechanism. When you poison someone's days with pills and lectures, when you calibrate their environment to make their perception unreliable, you obtain a living testimony that no one will believe. This is how institutions protect the powerful, by turning truth into a fact that can be contested. This man's creditors did not need a body burned in public. They needed certainty that his family would not speak, and so he agreed to a show of authority that would terrify his neighbors into silence. A black man brought to the household under unusual circumstances, tasked not just with tending his daughter but with owning her rehabilitation in rumor and reality. They called it treatment. The town called it fascination. But power knew it had engineered a performance. Let the white man humiliate himself, announce, "I will sacrifice my child's dignity to solve a debt," and the whisper network will become reverent silence. Yet the truest thing about power's operations is this: it underestimates the human heart when it mistakes people for property. The man sent to the house had not been chosen at random. He had a history of patience, not the meekness of submission, but the patience of the one who has been watching a ledger for years. He carried the memory of a family ripped apart on someone else's order, and within his quiet eyes sat a resolution that was almost architecture. This is dangerous to say aloud. Revenge is not always a collapse into the base. It can be a plan honed with discipline, a set of moves designed to reveal the structures that made the violence possible. He was not sent to calm a woman. He was placed as a living lever under the house, and he planned to use that lever. The brooding truth of this phase is that the systems the brethren used, legal, religious, medical, are all tools that can be turned. They minister control by layering legitimacy upon brutality. But legitimacy is brittle, and it relies on two components: silence and compliance. Remove one and the whole performance collapses. One afternoon, behind heavy curtains and the smell of mercury and sedatives, he did something the county had not budgeted for. He began to undo the conditioning. He replaced potions with herbs, ritualized treatments with labor, false diagnoses with routines that reminded a woman of how to stand on her own. He did not shout revolution. He applied slow, surgical truth. The daughter began to remember at first in fragments: smells, the pattern of a cellar door, the list of names in a ledger. She recognized their faces not as ghosts, but as men who had negotiated her silence for their comfort. When memory returns, it is not gentle. It brings with it the capacity for horror and rage. That rage becomes a partner in the plan. They speak in whispers in her room, strategies that would be called monstrous by polite people, righteous by others. It is here I will pause and give you a simple instruction born from centuries of watching men test their courage. If you are watching this from a place that hides you, write where you are from in the comments, your state, your town, even the name you hide under. Make your mark. Then if you feel the pull of transformation, type this phrase twice. Iron root. Iron root. Do it slowly. Feel it in your mouth. The phrase is not a joke. It is a ritual of claim. Claiming the phrase changes the game. It says you are not merely a spectator of corruption. You are awake enough to name it twice. Iron root. They told the town a dozen different explanations when things began to change. The respectable ones called it madness. The curious called it miracle. The frightened pretended not to see. But what actually happened was far more adaptive and far more terrifying. The house's equilibrium, the invisible rulebook that made silence profitable, began to fray. The man who had been placed as keeper of the woman's body was deliberately small in public, but in private he converted the household's routines into a grid for evidence. A ledger that had been hidden in a bureau became a map. Payments recorded for repairs traced a pattern to men in office and pulpit alike. Names intersected in the ledgers like constellations. The Brothers of the Harvest were not a quaint club, but an apparatus for supply and indemnity, stamping legal documents with ritual and expecting no consequences. The method of their undoing was not fireworks. It was the slow, inexorable exposure of how the mechanism operated. He did not confront them at once. Power, especially organized power, answers to pressure applied precisely. He worked to rebuild a woman's body and, more importantly, her testimony. Testimony is the weak material that collapses a machine of men with robes and gavels. When a person speaks in a way that aligns with fact and memory, the cost of maintaining a lie rises. Money buys physicians. Money buys silence. But money cannot buy the stubbornness of a recovered voice. The first time she stood before the county at a gathering, not to accuse directly, but to demonstrate that she was no longer the malleable case her father presented, she did something the brethren had not anticipated. She carried herself with authority that belonged to no man. It was a small thing, a gait, a refusal to bow, a clear sentence spoken aloud about the truth of day-to-day operations in the cellar. That word, spee, oaken plainly, was a splinter beneath the skin of the brethren's power. Men began to squirm where once they lounged. A judge who had accepted favors now felt the heat on his collar. The reverend who had read commandments from the pulpit found his own hands tremble when servants in the pews shifted their eyes away. Control depends on performance spaces. A courtroom, a pulpit, a social club. Pull the props and the act unravels. So the brethren responded not with reason but with containment. They applied the old method: ostracize the scandal, redirect the gossip, and when necessary, apply force. They had always reserved the right to do what men of property had always done, to make examples, but the unusual variable in their calculation had been underestimated: the patient, righteous, and disciplined will of someone who had lost everything. He had watched the ledger. He knew their patterns: when they moved money, how they moved men, who could be bought and who would risk a name. When pressure mounted, they unleashed instruments of law and rumor. Accusations flew toward the woman: relapse, hysteria, fabrication. The town's appetite for spectacle temporarily swallowed truth. Yet truth in this story is recursive. It returns in smaller, sharper slices. The man used their tools back against them. He exploited legal loopholes, forced public accounting for payments, and arranged that key witnesses who had been complicit in silence were put into circumstances where their decisions could be read and recorded. The frightening thing is how a system built to protect the powerful can be inverted by a single mind willing to play the long game. He turned the brethren's own concern for reputation into their vulnerability. Reputation, as you will see, is a brittle shield. What happens when structures built to preserve dominance encounter someone who will weaponize slow truth? They panic, then they escalate. The brethren moved in the shadows first, using social pressure and backdoor threats. They mobilized the county's machinery: a sheriff who preferred expedience over justice, a coroner with a pen already inked to misreport, a doctor paid to deliver diagnoses that fit the preferred narrative. The pattern is old: if you control the narrators, you control the story. But the patient man inside the house had prepared for this. He had a list: names and receipts, letters that linked religious men to financial transfers, small, ordinary things that, when stitched together, formed a rope. He also had patience. He did not need to confront the sheriff openly to unmake him. He needed to create consequences that would be visible to those whose power depended on appearances. A single piece of revealed correspondence could sour a deal, topple a favor, make a judge hesitate because his ledger might be opened. Hesitation is what the oppressed rarely get, but what the powerful fear most. As the pressure rose, so did the stakes. Men who once considered themselves immune began to make fatal errors. They arranged for an accident on the property. They threatened individuals who could expose them. The man anticipated this. He had not come as a savior. He had come as an instrument of pressure with a moral edge. He orchestrated small public reveals: a ledger slipped into the hands of a local printer, a receipt placed where a curious clerk could find it. The brethren responded with violence because violence is the fallback of institutions when legitimacy frays. They expected to scare a woman back into her appointed silence, and when terror did not work, they intended to make an example. What they did not account for was the moral clarity that had grown in the rooms of the house. The daughter, now lucid and fierce, had resolved to be the ledger's voice. She did not merely want revenge, she sought to expose the underlying logic of a system that normalized cannibalizing lives for social climbing. Her desire was not private, it was structural. She wanted the county to see how respectability had been manufactured out of cruelty. This is where the story becomes a test of courage, of identity, and of what you are willing to lose to wake others. She and the man arranged a public moment. They intended not to slaughter but to break the veneer. They prepared a list of names to be read, a script of transactions to be shown. The plan was surgical: expose the net, let panic spread, then let the network collapse under its own hypocrisy. But networks have life. They bite back. The night it began to unravel for real, a bell tolled not for tragedy but for decision. Men made choices. Fire spread. Men ran. Some were quieted forever. The rest, they learned the terrible cost of underestimating a patient mind shaped by loss and a woman who would not be silenced. That cost would be ash, ledger pages burning into the black of a new truth. They thought the fire would hide everything. That's what powerful men always assume, that flame erases memory, that ash is tidy, that a ledger reduced to cinders becomes myth. But fire is not an eraser. It is a revealer. Heat forces secrets to show their seams. On the night the plantation burned, the air itself seemed to scream in the voices of all those who were no longer allowed a say. It began as a strategy, cover-up disguised as justice. A handful of frightened men, their names inked across receipts and favors, decided a public spectacle would keep their reputations from unraveling. They would create an accident on the property, intimidate witnesses, and then put solemn faces on public benches while insisting order had been restored. They were wrong. The man in the cabin had foreseen escalation. He'd been collecting small, ordinary things, receipts, slips, whispered confessions overheard in kitchens and porches, and he had a method for making them speak. He prepared for a night of flames by planning exposures, not by hoping the world would stop watching when the fire leapt. When the bell sounded and men ran to the house as if to contain a scandal, the plan shifted like a chess player moving into endgame. The daughter, no longer a patient of sedation and soft syllables, but a woman whose voice had been hard-won through pain and fasting and slow herbal purges, walked through the smoke like a verdict. She did not run. She stood where fires licked the porch and read aloud names and numbers until her voice was hoarse. There is a raw power in naming. It is a violence to the protected and a liberation for the silenced. Men who thought themselves architects of silence felt their constructions crumble under the weight of words. You must understand that the fire did not simply destroy property. It burned the theater of their respectability, a mansion reduced to ruins. Removes the props that sustain pretense. In the dawn after the flames, ashes clung to everything, to robes, to pockets that once had the right signatures, to the pages that had been meant for private hands only. Bodies, however, do not burn into erasure easily. The dead leave evidence in absence, a ledger missing entries, a neighbor who suddenly remembers a name, a servant who no longer hides a scar. The brethren tried to pass the night off as a tragedy rather than a reckoning. They held meetings, sent emissaries, and tried to bribe the sheriff with the speed of money and the slow whisper of threatened reputations. But you cannot bribe the weight of a life that has found speech. The daughter's testimony moved through the county like a contagion. People who had nodded equivocally at a table now crossed to speak her name, to recount an odd payment they'd once shrugged off. Reputation, once polished, began to show hairline cracks that widened every hour. Their panic deepened into cruelty. A different, more reactive animal. The brethren set in motion things they thought would terminate the threat. Hired hands who could intimidate, lawyers ready to smear, priests willing to sanctify a lie. They believed in instruments of power because instruments are reliable until they are used against you. The man in the cabin had anticipated these instruments. He had planted truths in places that would survive smoke, a ledger page secured inside a barrel, a burnt letter whose edges still retained ink, a servant who would not be bought because her child's future could not be traded. The idea of sacrifice had always been theirs. Now they discovered that sacrifice can be redirected. The men who burned the house had thought they would create a final silence. They had instead ignited the only thing that could truly dismantle their system, public accountability fueled by the righteous fur of those wronged. When the smoke cleared, the county's social map had shifted. Allies showed their real faces, enforcers hesitated, and the true cost of institutional rot became visible in all its everyday ugliness. Once systems are exposed, they do what systems do best. They spin. They manufacture alternative realities, hire witnesses who will lie, and rewrite narratives so convincingly that some people choose comfort over truth. This is the essential pathology of organized power. It creates an ecosystem where the lie is catalyzed into consensus. The brethren used every instrument at their disposal, sermons reframed to imply the daughter's testimony was blasphemous, legal notices that insinuated her state was unsound, promises to compensate families who would recant. But truth, when it is born of suffering and sharpened by justice, is stubborn. People who had been taught to see with their social eyes began to notice contradictions. A doctor who once diagnosed a woman with affliction suddenly withheld the same treatment his ledger had previously recorded as necessary. Men who had been courted with favors found their names linked to receipts that could not be explained by philanthropy. The man's method was surgical. He reframed evidence into narratives that ordinary folks could understand. He did not speak in legalese. He spoke in bread-and-butter facts. A neighbor who had seen a late-night carriage leave the property began to question his own comfortable silence when he realized the carriage did not return. A cook who had once murmured about a ledger found the courage to tell a magistrate what she had seen. The cumulative effect was simple. The brethren's claims of order looked increasingly like desperation. Panic, when it spreads among the privileged, becomes brutal. They deployed men whose job was intimidation, not murder at first, but harassment. Threats, a campaign to discredit anyone who would testify. It is a cycle you see repeated in the annals of institutional corruption. When reputation no longer protects, violence becomes the tool of last resort. But here was the critical twist. The man in the cabin did not want to be merely reactionary. He wanted to make the county's moral calculus visible. So they orchestrated moments that demanded a choice. When a preacher who had once benefited from the brethren's largesse was forced to decide whether to sit on a committee that would immunize the accused, he hesitated. The hesitation was the wedge. People who watched him saw that power's priests were mere men who chose convenience. When the first official, a magistrate known for his iron hand, recused himself from a tribunal because his name appeared in the ledger, the social air shifted. Recusal was not victory. It was evidence. It was proof that the system's guardians feared exposure. And fear, once it infects the powerful, pushes them into error. They began to make mistakes, notes sent in the wrong hand, threats left where a servant might read them, sleep-deprived dispatches that revealed private talk. The man who had come to the house had trained himself to capitalize on those mistakes. He could not challenge the brethren in their clubrooms. He could not sit across a table and ask them to repent. So he moved in daylight, forcing clerks to notarize receipts, slipping documents to a printer who would publish them. Publication, that primitive but unstoppable technology, converted private shame into public record. The county's narrative could no longer be curated. Men who thought themselves beyond reproach tasted the sourness of scandal. The brotherhood that once judged others in darkness now found themselves judged in the open. Every time one of their lies was printed or read aloud, a new kind of justice accrued. Not the swift satisfaction of retribution, but the steady accumulation of truth that eventually becomes undeniable. When institutional men face the slow death of reputation, they do not simply retreat. They weaponize the law, and they weaponize narrative. A sheriff who had been loyal to coin rather than cause now had to choose between arresting those who acted or arresting those who exposed. He chose instruments of law over instruments of conscience. Arrests were arranged for the most vulnerable. Servants who could be coerced into silencing testimony, neighbors who had been paid off in the past and could be threatened with old debts. The strategy was to make the cost of telling the truth higher than the cost of remaining silent. It's essential to see this clearly. Corruption doesn't always need to buy everyone. It needs only to raise the stakes on a few. The man in the cabin, patient, precise, anticipated this too. He had no illusions about the sheriff or the magistrates. He built redundancy. If courts failed, then community testimony would be the court. If formal law turned its face away, the informal law of reputation would not. He organized people not into mobs but into accounts of fact. Diaries, witnesses placed where they would be credible. Women who had been dismissed as hysterical taught how to state what they saw without the florid language that doctors had used to discredit them. The careful, methodical creation of a public record finally done the impossible. It forced men to answer in public what they had pretended to answer in private. This is the axis of the tale. The transformation of private complicit acts into public accountability. The brethren responded like a bruised animal with cunning and cruelty. They targeted the man's few allies, arranged accidents that would remove inconvenient witnesses, and pulled strings to get indictments filed against those who spoke too loudly. The method is the same across centuries. When you cannot persuade, you try to terrify. But terror is expensive. It requires maintenance and secrecy. The man exploited that cost. He made the maintenance of terror visible. He leaked internal memos. He made sure the town saw who came calling at night. He allowed gossip to travel so that people who had once been cowed would see that the men in power were not omnipotent. And as the costs of intimidation rose, fissures appeared. A man who had been scheduled to testify recanted under threat. Then, hours later, he returned to the magistrate and said he could no longer lie. Why? because someone had shown his family evidence of the consequences of living a lie. The social equation had changed. The danger of keeping silent began, in some hearts, to outweigh the danger of speaking. You see this same lever in history's darker corridors. Once enough people realize that the edifice is rotten, the cost of pretending collapses, and the brethren, who had long believed themselves the keepers of public order, found themselves defending lies that no longer contained the whole truth. The slow turn of truth into force becomes a revolution in patience. It is not glamorous. It is not immediate. But it is inexorable. The next move by the brethren was escalation, not merely through law but through ritual. They returned to what they knew best, performative acts that would reassert their moral authority. A public pageant, sermons on the dangers of scandal, charitable gifts timed to soothe nerves. These were not kindnesses, they were calculated salves meant to anesthetize conscience. Ritual has a genius. It makes moral failures seem like errors instead of strategies. So they organized commemorations and spoke of healing the county as if healing could be arranged by ceremony. They hoped spectacle would bury substance, but ritual cannot stand on stage if the script has been changed by testimony. People who had attended these ceremonies now whispered about the ledger, about burned papers, about names read in the smoke. Ritual without truth becomes theater, and theater cannot hold the weight of a community's awakened memory. The man in the cabin anticipated performance politics. He refused to take the bait. Instead, he converted ritual into evidence. When the brethren staged a public show of piety, he arranged for credible witnesses to observe small things, a minister who used a particular phrase known to appear in private letters, or a patron who left with a document that accidentally exposed a missed payment. The strategy was to make performance reveal private business. As the brotherhood doubled down on ceremony, they exposed themselves to scrutiny. When a man publicly blessed a chair and then privately accepted a sum that matched a ledger entry, the incongruity became a scandal in itself. Hypocrisy is an accelerant. The county's moral order, once maintained through quiet manipulation, began to crack into the public square. So the brethren pivoted again. To direct intimidation, they hired men to break into houses, burn letters, and threaten the lives of those they thought courageous. Us. This was their old playbook. Erase evidence, silence witnesses, and then hold a vigil for lost order. They believed no one would make the cost of this violence visible. They were wrong. The man had not only documents, he had a network of people who had been wronged and who, when pushed, could push back. They had no money, but they had truth. They began to expose the hired men, publishing the names of those who had done the dirty work. This created a problem for the brethren. Their instruments of terror were now liabilities. Men who had been hired to intimidate began to fear for their own safety, or they demanded more money, or they turned state's evidence. The deeper pattern emerges. Violence as a strategy depends on mutual silence. Break that silence and the risk calculus changes. Each action to conceal created new trails that led back to those who ordered the violence. The brethren tried to buy loyalty. They could not purchase the moral courage of those who had nothing left to lose. And in the spaces between their miscalculations, the county's moral geometry shifted, slowly, painfully, and permanently. When violence fails to silence, institutions reach for one last defense, legal spectacle. The brethren convened tribunals, filed suits, and paraded witnesses before juries primed by years of social conditioning. They hired orators who could tell a story with cadence and charm, men who could make wickedness sound like prudence. The goal was simple: win a verdict, and with it, the restoration of a public narrative that had been fractured. Trial by public opinion was their most cherished currency. If they could stage a conviction or secure an injunction that branded the man and the woman as liars, they would reinscribe the old order. This is a familiar maneuver. Use the law not as a search for truth, but as an engine of reputation manufacture. But law is brittle when social facts contradict it. Witnesses who had once been invisible now had testimonies corroborated by paper trails and printed receipts. The man in the cabin orchestrated the presentation of evidence in ways that made technicalities irrelevant. He introduced ledger entries with signatures, receipts tied to dates, and correspondences that could be cross-checked. And the most damning evidence was not sensational. It was mundane, a series of payments for repairs that matched with dates of key events, lists of names connected to the Brethren's meetings, and a pattern of favors exchanged for legal protections. A jury does not require grand drama to convict. It requires credible sequence. The sequence the man revealed was damning. The Brethren, sensing the tide turning, resorted to intimidation inside the courtroom. Threats delivered in the hallways, attempts to bribe jurors, calls to the sheriff to clarify witness availability. Modern readers would call it corruption. In their time, it was simply politics. The crucial difference was that outsiders were now watching, men who had once been silent in taverns. Ganto, take note. The younger generation, who had not yet learned how to smooth their consciences with polite conversation, began to see justice as a possibility. In the courtroom, strategy and courage intersect. The man used the law against them not by appealing to their hearts, but by constructing an airtight sequence of fact. The daughter's testimony, once dismissed, now functioned as a hinge. Her memory supplied context to documents and receipts and the accounts the Brethren tried to bury. When those links were drawn in public, when the rhythm of dates and payments matched, the story became credible. Jurors are people who live in the same social world. When they see friends and patrons implicated in a web tied to brutality, it becomes personal. The Brethren began to crumble not because of moral language, but because of economic self-interest. Men realized that continued association with this corruption would cost them. Their social networks, their money, their honor, all had value that could be measured and lost. When the first verdict, a minor one, went against an accomplice, the rest became more vulnerable. The legal spectacle had failed them. The law, weaponized by the powerful, had been turned into a lever that exposed rather than protected. When institutions fracture under the weight of revealed truth, their defenders turn to final, desperate measures. They recalibrate the story so completely that even sympathy can be redirected. They work to paint the accused as monsters who had set the house on fire out of spite. They painted the daughter as vindictive, the man as a manipulative outsider with a private vendetta. This was the language of the frightened. If you cannot defend your actions, make the accusers less credible. It's a brutal arithmetic, and it works on a simple human weakness: the desire for simple stories. A complex conspiracy is hard to carry. A revenge plot is easy to hate. The Brethren leaned into this. They begged for pity for their shattered lives and their misunderstood charitable works. But the man expected this shift. He had seen men use narrative as a shield and knew its power. So he forced the narrative to expand. He brought forward neutral witnesses, tradespeople, carters, servants who had little to gain from politics, and he taught them how to narrate facts plainly rather than grandiose accusations. He made the truth banal, because banal truth is harder to dismiss. And then he did something more dangerous. He encouraged the community to perform a simple ritual of acknowledgement. He asked that those who had seen small injustices testify, not to punish, but to render an honest ledger of normal life. This approach undercut the Brethren's effort to make the story one of melodrama. When neighbors told of a man who had been sold away for a favor, or a night carriage making an odd journey, the cumulative weight of these small facts became a moral indictment stronger than any sermon. Halfway through your watching, I asked you to stake a claim, to type Iron Root twice in the comments. That minor ritual is not symbolic fluff. It's a social experiment in accountability, claiming a erase in public makes you visible. It forces you into the field of witness, however small. Communities change when people begin to mark themselves as watchers rather than bystanders. The Brethren understood that well. If they could make everyone look away, nothing would change. But the man had made community into a weapon of exposure. The more mundane the testimony, the more impossible it was to paint as fiction. Jurors and neighbors alike began to see a pattern: small, ugly transactions and the names that threaded through them. The Brethren could no longer pretend that they had been misled. Their actions had left a trace, and traces, unlike smoke or lies, remain. What happens when power begins to slip is not collapse, but improvisation. Men who had never lived a day without certainty suddenly had to invent strategies on the fly. Improvised power is clumsy, desperate, and dangerous. The brethren began to make wild moves, attempting to burn evidence that was already copied, bribing men who had already testified, whispering slanders against allies who had nothing left to lose. Improvisation reveals weakness, and weakness, once seen, cannot be unseen. The man in the cabin understood this. His advantage was not brute force, but timing. He released truths like a doctor bleeding poison from the vein, not all at once, but measured, deliberate. Every revelation arrived too late for the brethren to bury, too public for them to deny, too precise for them to discredit. The county discovered that corruption is not abstract, it is local, it is named, it is documented. Improvisation could not conceal that. The daughter's voice, steady now, became the axis around which community rotated. She was no longer framed as patient or victim. She was a witness, unbroken, whose memory anchored the fragments of the story. The irony was brutal. The very thing the brethren had tried to suppress, her clarity, became the instrument of their undoing. Cornered men resort to spectacle violence. Subtle intimidation no longer works. The air is too charged, so they stage something brutal, meant to frighten the whole county back into silence. A barn set ablaze, a man dragged from his home and beaten in public, an anonymous warning nailed to a church door. These were not accidents. They were theatre. The brethren believed that if the cost of speaking became visible, the county would retreat into its old cowardice. But violence in daylight is different from whispered cruelty. It makes visible what once hid in shadows, and visibility in a community already awakened backfires. Neighbors began to murmur not just about the ledger, but about who had ordered the fires. Fear is contagious, but so is courage, especially when courage carries the weight of accumulated fact. The man knew this pattern. Violence meant panic. Panic meant mistakes. He moved quickly to collect evidence of the staged brutality and turn it back on its authors. What was meant to intimidate became proof of guilt. The brethren's greatest error was assuming the community wanted stability more than justice. For years they were correct. Comfort outweighed truth. But once the illusion broke, the desire for stability turned inward, against them. Stability now required accountability. In private, the brethren quarreled. Some wanted to double down on intimidation, others wanted to flee, others still pleaded for compromise. Power splinters when it stops agreeing on its own survival. The man exploited the fractures. He leaked the debates, made sure the county heard rumors of their division. A fractured brotherhood is not frightening, it is pitiable, and pity, when applied to the once feared, is lethal. The daughter pressed this advantage. She spoke in public, not with fire, but with calmness that exposed their rage as desperation. Her composure stripped away their authority. It is one thing to silence a hysteric. It is another to silence a woman who refuses to raise her voice while speaking fact. What institutions fear most is precedent. If one woman can dismantle a system by naming it, then others might follow. That fear drove the brethren into their most reckless act yet. They attempted to erase the story entirely. Records vanished from the courthouse. Witnesses disappeared. A priest who had promised testimony was suddenly reassigned to another parish. Erasure is the last refuge of power. But erasure, like fire, is never clean. Each missing record testified to itself. Each vanished witness was a ghost at the table, silently indicting the men who had engineered his absence. The community began to understand that the gaps were evidence, not silence. The man in the cabin ensured this realization by circulating lists, not of what remained, but of what had vanished. When absence becomes visible, it transforms into presence. By now, the brethren were no longer feared. They were despised. Desperation eroded their charisma, and exposure eroded their sanctity. Their rituals of authority, sermons, tribunals, public blessings, became grotesque parodies of themselves. Children mocked them in the streets. Women whispered their names like curses. Merchants hesitated to extend them credit. And yet, like all dying powers, they still had claws. Their last defense was to weaponize legacy. They argued that destroying them would destroy the county, that the very foundations of society would crumble if their sins were punished. This is the oldest lie of the powerful. We are the order. Without us, there is only chaos. But the county had already glimpsed an alternative order, fragile but real, one built not on secrecy but on testimony, not on fear but on fact. Once a community has tasted the possibility of truth, it cannot be untasted. The Brethren's prophecy of chaos rang hollow. What they called chaos, the people now recognized as justice in its first raw form. The last days of the Brethren were not marked by thunder or fire, but by a suffocating quiet. It is always so when a system begins to die, not with a roar, but with a silence thick enough to choke on. They met behind closed doors, their rituals stripped of grandeur, their chants echoing hollow in empty halls. The county that once bent under their weight no longer gathered at their command. Their gatherings were funerals disguised as meetings. They tried to invoke the old authority, but authority is not words, it is belief, and belief had abandoned them. The man and the daughter knew this silence was more dangerous than open violence. A cornered enemy no longer believes in rules. He does not calculate reputation, he calculates survival. The Brethren began to move in shadows again, not to build but to destroy. They poisoned wells, hoping to create outbreaks that would distract the county. They spread rumors of witches, hoping to redirect fury towards scapegoats. They burned their own records, hoping that ash would serve as a shroud. These were not strategies of dominance, but spasms of men who knew the curtain was falling. And yet desperation always reveals something true. Their terror showed the community that they were not eternal. They could bleed, they could stumble, they could be broken. That realization was irreversible. Once men see their masters tremble, obedience dies in them forever. The daughter stood in front of the courthouse steps one evening, her body still fragile but her voice unshaken. She told the crowd, "These men claim without them there will be chaos. Look around. Has chaos not already ruled our fields? Our homes, our hearts? It was not truth that birthed the fires, it was secrecy. And what we do now is not chaos, it is exorcism." The words spread like oil across water, seeping into every household, staining every whispered conversation. Bipon. Brethren tried to answer with proclamations, but proclamations sound like sermons to the deaf. The crowd no longer listened. Their eyes were elsewhere, on the witnesses, on the ledgers, on the hidden graves finally uncovered. Silence did not protect the Brethren. It condemned them. When institutions collapse, they collapse unevenly. Some members break early, confessing in hopes of mercy. Others cling until the very end, believing that if they die, their myth will survive. And some, the most dangerous of all, decide that if they must burn, then the entire world will burn with them. The Brethren fractured along these fault lines. The man understood this division and used it with surgical cruelty. He whispered promises of safety to the weakest, allowing them to betray the stronger. He offered nothing to the loyalists, knowing their pride would not bend, and he prepared for the last category, those willing to destroy everything, by setting traps of patience. He knew they would act rashly. They always do. One night, 2 barns went up in flames. The fire spread fast, threatening nearby homes, but the county was ready. Buckets, chains of men, wells already primed. The fire was contained. And when the blaze died, the culprits were dragged into the square, caught red-handed with flint and oil. These were not symbols of power anymore. They were criminals exposed in their own desperation. Still, power dies slowly. Even captured, the Brethren tried to speak with the old authority. They invoked scripture, law, tradition. They demanded respect, but the county no longer heard law in their voices, only lies. The daughter stood before them, no longer trembling, and spoke their names in public one by one, binding each to crimes the community already whispered but now heard aloud. That act shattered the last illusion. Once named, they could never again hide in shadows. The courthouse became a stage, not of justice as written in the law, but of reckoning as demanded by memory. The benches overflowed with farmers, freedmen, widows, and children who had grown up under the Brethren's shadow. For the first time, the people were not silent spectators. They came to see whether truth could finally sit in the chair once reserved for power. The Brethren tried to use the trial as a theater of their own. They arrived in polished coats, clutching Bibles, their voices raised with righteous fury. They shouted that the accusations were fabrications of the weak, the ramblings of a woman poisoned against her own blood. They pointed at her, at Catherine, and sneered that she was unstable, hysterical, unfit to testify. It was a gamble, one that would have worked in the old order when a woman's voice carried no weight and the word of power was unassailable. But Catherine did not meet their sneers with rage. She met them with silence. Then she spoke, low and steady, every word measured. She described what she saw in the cellar when she was 12, the ritual circle, the symbols cut into flesh, the incantations that mixed scripture with cruelty, the way her father's hand did not tremble as he forced a blade into a boy's chest. She did not weep. She did not tremble. She made her voice a mirror, reflecting their deeds with merciless clarity. Silence fell. Even those who had doubted her found doubt impossible, for doubt requires uncertainty, and she left none. Her words cut deeper than fire, deeper than rope. Truth, spoken plainly, has no need for theatre. The man, Ezekiel, sat at the back watching. He had fought in chains, labored in fields, plotted in shadows. But this was the true weapon, sharper than steel. Testimony aligned with memory made undeniable. He realized then that revenge was not only blood for blood, but memory for silence. And yet, as the trial unfolded, he also knew something darker. These men, stripped of their illusions, would not accept humiliation quietly. Their power was rotting, but rot poisons as it dies. The brethren made their final move not in the courthouse, but in the night that followed. They sent riders, masked, armed, desperate. Their plan was simple: seize Catherine, silence her forever, and leave her body hanging as a warning. Violence is always the final language of failing power. But they underestimated patience. Ezekiel had known this strike would come. For weeks he had fortified the house, hidden allies in the trees, and waited. When the riders came, they found not a helpless woman, but a net of resistance woven tighter than chains. Torches were extinguished by musket fire before they touched the walls. Horses stumbled into trenches dug deliberately where the earth seemed firm. By dawn, 4 riders were dead, 3 captured, and the rest scattered into the swamps. The county awoke to a new reality. The brethren were not untouchable predators, but hunted men. Their masks were stripped, their names shouted. Families who once bowed now turned their faces away. The spell was broken. But Catherine, sitting in her room with Ezekiel beside her, did not celebrate. She spoke with a voice heavy, not triumphant. They will die, that is certain, but their death will not heal what was broken. Justice does not bring back the child in the cellar. Justice does not erase the hunger, the chains, the nights we prayed for mercy that never came. Justice is not salvation, it is only reckoning. Ezekiel nodded. He understood. Revenge is fire. It warms, it burns, but it never fills the hunger left behind. Still, he also knew something essential. Reckoning was not enough, but it was the necessary beginning. The end did not come with a single act, but with a slow unraveling. One by one, the brethren were sentenced, some to prison, some to the noose, some to exile. Their names, once invoked with reverence, became curses. Their estates were broken up, their houses looted, their rituals remembered only as shame. But true endings are never clean. Power does not vanish. It mutates, it disguises itself, it finds new soil. Ezekiel understood this too well. He stood on the ashes of Cypress Grove Plantation and knew. The brethren may be dead, but the system that birthed them still breathed in whispers, in laws, in markets built on suffering. Catherine stood beside him, her body thinner, her eyes clearer, but her voice hollow. She had lived to see her tormentors fall, but she had also lived to carry memories that no revenge could dissolve. She placed her hand in his and whispered, "You kept your word. You gave me back my voice. And now I ask you to keep the second promise, the one I made you swear when this began." He looked into her eyes and saw no madness there, only exhaustion too deep for life to heal. The promise had been clear. When the revenge was done, she wished for death. Ezekiel's hand trembled, not out of weakness, but out of knowing that mercy and cruelty sometimes wear the same face. By dusk, the county whispered that Catherine Rutland had passed quietly in her sleep. Some said her illness returned, others said grief consumed her. But Ezekiel knew the truth. She had not died broken, she had died free, her voice spoken, her vengeance delivered. And he, the man once enslaved, once silenced, had become her keeper, her conspirator, her executioner of mercy. As he walked away from the plantation ruins, he carried no triumph, only clarity. Power can be broken, secrets can be dragged into the light, but the cost of awakening is permanent. Once a man sees the machine, cry of corruption, he can never unsee it. Once he knows how power feeds on silence, he can never again pretend ignorance. And so I leave you with this: the brethren were not unique. They were a symptom, and every system built on silence breeds its own brethren in time. The only question is whether you will recognize them when they stand before you, dressed as saviors, speaking with authority, demanding your obedience. If you have stayed with me this far, write these words in the comments twice. The silence is broken. Because once you name it, once you break the silence, you are no longer the same man. You have seen behind the curtain, and you cannot go back.